1 Samuel chapter 2 is where we're going to be tonight. I found a passage in the New Testament talking about when, God says, I desire the heart, that, the fat of the offering or the burnt offering isn't what I want, but, a sincere heart. And that's the same thing that Samuel tells Saul when he had, disobeyed God and he had brought back the plunder from the war and rather than destroying everything. And Samuel says that same thing to him. And that was the reference that started drawing me back to this chapter. And I started looking at, Samuel, and I was having a lot of fun reading through his story. But the story of his mother is something that kind of stuck with me. So we're going to take a little bit of time and we're going to look at Hannah. And in particular, this prayer that she's going to say in chapter 2. And a couple of the things that I think about, because we're going to do just a little bit of review on chapter 1, just to kind of get our setting of where she was and the kind of things that she was going through. But when I was reading this chapter, it kind of challenges me to look at it as a New Testament Christian point of view. And it's really just kind of like, what are the questions that come to my heart or come to my mind when I'm going through this and the pictures that I start pondering. We don't know a ton about her or her family. We're given a little bit of lineage, and we know that she's married to a fellow named, let's see if we can find him, Elkanah, I believe. And he had 2 wives, Hannah, Peninnah, that works. The idea of having 2 wives, is this kind of one. Hannah's barren; she can't have children. That could be one of the reasons he has 2 wives. And it's not really tonight. I'm not really concerned about that topic of the idea that he has 2 wives, but it is something that's like we never see it endorsed in the Bible, and it doesn't really ever match any of the pictures that we're given of a marriage, consecrated by the Lord. It's always talking about one man and one woman. But this situation, one of the things that's interesting to know is that he has a certain fondness and a certain love for Hannah. And, his heart's for her. And every year they would go to Shiloh to make an offering. And he'd always give her a double portion to be able to offer. And I think it's interesting that she was always willing to give that right to the Lord. And there's some jealousy that starts rising up between these 2 women. And the one's jealous because the other has children and she doesn't, and the other's jealous because she doesn't have her husband's love, quite like Hannah does. And she used to mock her for it to the point that it would, it'd bring her to great distress. And when we get to this area where it's in Hannah's vow, she gets to this place where she was in bitterness of soul in verse 10, and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. And she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head. So, she's proclaiming that she's willing to give him over as like the Nazarite type vow. And, but this place, one of the few things we know about her is that she's a prayer warrior. It seems like she's constantly praying. And, because just in this little snippet that we get from her, this little chapter and a half really, everything she has to say or do, it's in this moment of about to pray or in prayer. And we have Eli shows up, another important character that's going to have a large role to play in the first part of Samuel's life. He just saw her there in anguish and seemed like she was murmuring and accused her of being drunk early in the morning and was going to send her away. And she says in verse 16, do not consider your maidservant a wicked woman, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief I have spoken until now. And verse 9 there, she said how, I haven't had any intoxicating drink, and that she's here bearing her soul before the Lord. Eli isn't really a particularly, good character in the Bible. Not really a upright person. But it's interesting, one of the things that he does there, because he says, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked of him. And she said, Let your maidservant find favor in your sight. So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. So one of the interesting things what happened right there is because Samuel is going to be the one that takes the torch from Eli. And right here, he just kind of gave his blessing to Hannah for that to begin. And it's like he's almost blessing contrary to his own walk. But the interesting thing at the same time is there's going to be this kind of revival in a way that's coming. He's born into Israel in a very interesting time because they haven't had a king up to this date. So where they're going to establish Saul as king is going to put a big change in Israel. And God needs a key player to help put these things in motion. And I like how spectacular God makes it in a way, if you would, because he doesn't just pick a person out of the crowd. He makes it miraculous from the get-go. It makes it so this isn't ordained. This is, by my will and by my authority. And but it was also by an offering at the same time, a devotion. And it was based on this, covenant, if you would, between her and God, where she made that oath, that I want something to be able to give to you to use as you would. And that's what he was waiting for. And she gets to the point where, she bears a son, and she gives him the name Samuel, saying, because I have asked for him of the Lord. And so this little boy comes into her life, and as they go to do their yearly sacrifice, she asks if she can stay behind, give them some time to wean the child, and just enjoy those first few years of being a mother to him. And her husband says an interesting thing, because do what seems best to you, wait until you've weaned him, only let the Lord establish his words. And I think that's an interesting way to put it, because he has this thing, if the Lord has willed it, if the Lord has said it, let that be done. And I don't know 100% how he felt about this beforehand, because I don't get the impression that he was involved in that covenant that she made with him to give Samuel over. But right here, he's saying this is of the Lord and this is by the Lord, so it should be done according to his will. So, and then another interesting piece before we get into chapter 2. So in verse 24, I found it interesting where it says she took 3 bulls, 1 ephah of flour, a skin of wine, and brought them with him to the house of the Lord. I started doing a little study, looking at all these different people when they were going on a journey, and I found it interesting how many of them brought a similar bundle of supplies with them. When David goes to the camp of Saul against the Philistines, he takes similar provisions with him. And I just started to do a little study. It's been kind of fun, but this idea of bringing the flour and the wine, and this is another little snippet we get in their picture of their lives, that they must be wealthy if they're able to send 3 bulls as a sacrifice. It was the largest sacrifice you could bring. And we often compare this to the idea of a tractor. Because it was your ability to work, and very expensive to keep. So after they had slaughtered the bull and brought the child to Eli, and she said, "O my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood by you here praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition, which I asked of him. Therefore I also have lent him to the Lord as long as he lives, and shall be lent to the Lord." So they worship the Lord there. So this is what a little Eli, I get the impression, kind of has a bit of a dry ministry. Not a lot's happening. And right here, I think it probably was just a side notion, or just kind of a afterthought that he did here, where he just sees this woman one day and says, may the Lord grant you what's on your heart. And then she comes back a while later and says, hey, look, this is what has happened. And I wonder if he remembered. Well, it says he remembers. And but I wonder what he thought about that. I wonder if he knew beforehand about the fact that he was going to receive this child and pretty much end up raising him. But I like how they both worshipped the Lord. It was something that caught both of their attentions. So anyway, that's our prequel into what we're going to be going through. So she's going to say this prophetic prayer, which I find very interesting, and I love so many of the key points and the ways that this flows. So in verse 1 of chapter 2, and Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoices in the Lord, and my horn is exalted in the Lord. I smile at my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation." So the first thing that stuck out to me is we're looking at a capital L-O-R-D. Who is she speaking to? Who is this prayer to? We're talking about God Almighty, the Lord above over all creation. And that becomes particularly important when we start looking at the prophetic things that she says in this prayer. My horn is exalted in the Lord, and I smile at my enemies. I did a little bit of a word search looking at what the word horn means in the Bible. What would it represent? It represents strength, honor, ability. It also represented royalty and power in that. So her strength and her ability and her glory is being exalted in the Lord. I have the ability to smile at my enemies, and because I rejoice in your salvation. It's an interesting way to put it, that the salvation you've given me, and this redemption, this renewing that has come about. So the ability to smile at your enemies, for her, she has a very particular enemy, and it's this other wife that we've talked about. And we're going to read a couple verses, and I can't help but think that's one of the main people that she's thinking of. But there's another thing to think about is when someone was barren, they understood, or they had this thing that they were going through, that, God's the one that's making you barren. Or they had these ideas that, you're being punished by God for something you've done. There must be some type of sin that you're hiding. We went through that all over with Job. And that was what every accusation against him was. What is your secret sin? What is preventing God from doing this in your life? And I imagine that because I wonder if she had the same thing happening with her to a degree. If people were saying, well, what secret sin do you have? What curse is there on you that you're unable to bear children? She knew that she had no curse, but you wonder if she ever doubted. Is there something that I've done that we haven't remedied? But here, she's able to smile at her enemies, and there's almost this ha-ha sense in a way about it, where it's like there was no division, and it wasn't a repentance issue. It was a asking of the Lord for this. And I think about how amazing that is, this fact that that's the joy that she can find in that place. Verse 2, no one is holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you, nor is there any rock like our God. Yet again, we see capital L or Lord there. And so it says no one is holy like our God. And great perspective that she has here. She understands that God is above, God is separate, and, holy unto. And I was doing a study on holy one time, and so God is holy apart from everything. But those things that he makes holy, he doesn't make holy apart from, but holy unto him. It's kind of like a drawing in, like a sharing type attribute. It's that drawing them to himself. And nor is there any like our, a little nearsighted, so when it's at an angle with the light, it's a little hard to read, but it says, nor is there any rock like our God. And there's so many verses that ring through my mind in the New Testament referring to Jesus as the rock, or, the foundation, the cornerstone, or, this is our pride, this is our strength, our solid foundation. And I think of the fact that, she's already establishing him as a solid point. I also think about the rock that the living water was flowing from. In their history, there was this time that was the only source of living water that they had. And even today for us as Christians, it's still true. He is our only source of life. Verse 3 says, "Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is the God of knowledge, and by him all things are weighed." Kind of this calling almost to shame in a way. You have spoken proudly against God. You've taken pride in your standing, and in your arrogance you've proclaimed against him. And this is professing, and I'm not trying to plan it in this area, but it's still drawing my mind to Job, where this accuser was bringing against him, what is your separation? What's causing it so you can't have anything to do with God? We were reading through Acts when Paul was captured by the Romans for the first time, and there's this interesting thing he does where he doesn't address the crowd. He addresses Paul and says, "What is it you've done?" And he doesn't have an interest in the accusers or those trying to be against him. He has an interest in the person. And then as they go through it, even they get to a point where it's like, we see no fault in this man. No, just send him away. And I just love that standing where, where is your pride when you're trying to accuse those beloved by God? For the Lord is the God of knowledge. I wrote down the wrong reference. I had a reference for Timothy. It wasn't this verse, but there's a verse that says that there are those that have acquired learning, but they have no knowledge. And it's true. I know tons of people that will brag and boast in how much they know without knowing anything, or how much of their learning or knowledge doesn't have a foundation to it. It's kind of, head smarts or a philosophical type approach. And it's not that you can't reason things out, but you can reason things away from truth at the same time, because if you don't have a foundation of fact to establish things on. But this idea that knowledge belongs to God, and he will give knowledge to those that deserve it. And I think about this idea of that challenge where, do I pursue knowledge from God, or do I just hope to obtain knowledge? Because I think the sourcing is very important, that people remember to be humble and to keep that flowing from the proper direction. By him all actions are weighed. Weight has an interesting history. Over in, just kind of a little side note, but over in France right now, there's this building where they have these weights, and it's the official gram, and they have all the different weights. And the seriousness to this is the fact that any weight has to be based off from the one, because if you don't base from one weight, it can be anything. And for there to be fair trade and, an equal field, they have to have the standard. And it's the same in the States. We also have our weights for, our different measures. And but these are kept under lock and key. And the ones over in France are interesting because they're even under guard. And when you pull up pictures of them, they're just these little cylinders that will be in a glass jar in a glass case with people guarding it to make sure that they're never taken or even tampered with. They even have rules of how they can be picked up and used. And the only case that they are used is to test a new weight. And if the new weight's the same, then they lock the one away again, and they'll treat the new one similar. So I did a little research on how much does it cost to get yourself one of these, approved weights for scale, if you would. So 1/16 of a gram weight in a cylinder for a Class 1 certification is $154. And when you order it, you're going to get this little metal weight that's exactly on the dot. And I've heard stories of people that have bought these, and they'll buy a whole box with all the different weights, and it's a couple $1,000s. And one story, somebody had put a sticker on one, and suddenly it was worthless, because no matter how much you clean it, it's not an exact weight. You've defiled its ability to measure. Same thing would go for a marker. If you put a marker on it, you've tampered with this weight. So when I look at this idea that God, where it says, and by him actions are weighed, so he's the one that has the weights that can judge our actions. He's the one that has the official, this is how things are measured, this is how things are going to be weighed, and nothing can tamper with his weight. And if you want an accurate scale or an accurate judge, if you would, over actions, it has to come from him, because that's the only source. Just the same way that if we want to make sure that you have 1 gram, if you want to verify that that is a fully accurate, you have to go to France and compare it to that one. And even then, you're not going to be able to walk in there and tamper with it or do what you please. You have to go through the motions. And I just love that quality of God, that is something that he contains, that he controls, and it's under his authority. Moving on into verse 4, it says, the bows of mighty men are broken, and those who stumbled are girded with strength. The mighty men. You read stories about David and his mighty men, and it seems like kings of this age would always surround themselves with the elect, the strongest warriors, and they always had some type of mighty deed about them or some attribute or quality. David's mighty men are interesting because when it lists them out, it will say things like, this man killed or slew 80 men in one battle, and he moved swifter than any youth, and and interesting things. They'll list out their qualities that they exhibited, but then you also find a nobility in these people as well. You don't find just a physical strength, but also like a nobility. But here we're seeing this idea of these mighty men that would stand against the people of God, and their bows are broken, their weapons of war are useless. I have a friend at work. He was out hunting and he tripped on his bow and landed on it and mushed it on a rock, and he ruined the ends of his bow, and it's no longer any good. He was saying he'll draw it and he can hear it cracking, so he's afraid to draw it because he knows the amount of pressure on it could just break right in his hands. And it's the same idea here. When you have a broken bow, it's of no use to you. Your ability is gone. Those who have stumbled have been girded with strength. It's an interesting verse because this idea that you're stumble, you don't have the ability to stand on your own, but he has given you a brace of strength from God. Those who are full have hired themselves out for bread, and the hungry have ceased to hunger. Even the barren have borne 7, and she who has many children has become feeble. Talking about this idea that, just that same comparison. For her, she's looking at her immediate situation. Those who had plenty have suddenly found themselves in want. And from a spiritual perspective, because who is our bread of life, And, when you've been given that, you cease to hunger. And when it says even the barren has borne 7, 7 is a number of completion. And even with her, this is interesting because it's kind of prophetic for herself in a way, because she continues to bear children after Samuel. It's not her last child. She continues to have this fruitful life. And I like how much joy and completion she is able to obtain through that. And it all starts with that one prayer that she said before the Lord. Noticing, though, that, God's in control of that. And I was pondering the idea of how precious life is, how sensitive or how perfect the setting has to be for a human life to begin, and how frail it is. And if the conditions and the elements don't line up perfectly, life can't begin. And when somebody's barren, there's almost nothing you can do for that situation. And that's under God's control completely. And I think it's a sad idea of how lax people are, how unconcerned they are with that idea, that how involved he is in this process, and that it's without his hand over something like this, that a human life wouldn't even proceed. And she understands that it's from him, and she understands that if she wanted to bear a child, that she had to ask of him for that. And where it says that, find my verse again here. And she who has many children has become feeble. I was pondering the idea of feeble, and the first thing that comes to mind is weak, or an inability. But I also think about the idea, because it's obvious you wouldn't be able to bear children if you're feeble, but you also wouldn't be able to nurture them either. The children that you do have, would you be able to care for them, provide for them, or to raise them as you would? And I'm thinking about this also in, the terms of the church, because the church has the ability to spread. It has the ability to grow, and for people to come to Christ and to become strong, to be girded with strength. And those that claim to be able to bear that same thing are feeble. They don't have the ability to give anyone anything except a name. They can't nurture, they can't grow, and they can't provide. And yet again, where's that source? Where's life coming from but from the Lord? The Lord kills and the Lord makes alive. He brings down to the grave and brings up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich, and he brings low and lifts up. He kills and makes alive. She's pretty much hitting on almost every subject that you can with God. She started by talking about how he's holy and he's above all, and there's nobody else beside him. He's the Lord of knowledge. He has strength. He has the ability to make people fruitful, and now she's professing he has the ability to kill. That's his authority. He chooses when things begin and when things end, and he decides who makes alive. Jesus rose back from the grave, showing that he had conquered death, showing that he had the ability and the authority to give life to whomever he chooses. And he chooses his church to offer that to freely for us. The ability to conquer death through life through him. He brings down to the grave and he brings up. I love that verse right there. There's nothing permanent when it comes to God. There's nothing that he doesn't have control over. Death is the undefeatable thing that man has. There's nothing in our own power that we can do to alter or prevent or to cope with death. And here it is in just one short little sentence. God has that ability to bring down, has that ability to bring up. And he makes poor and he makes rich. He brings low and he lifts high. He has the ability to control your standing. How prideful people can be and how insulted they can be when you insinuate that they don't have the control, or it wasn't by their own authority that they were able to obtain their status or their riches. Insinuate that God's in control of that. But it's true, because he can take away in an instant what you have. I'm not saying that that's his intention, but it's the fact that that's his authority and his power that he has. I was thinking about the idea of the farmer. And unless God makes the crop grow, he isn't going to have anything to profit from. He's not going to have any, fruit of his labor. But at the same time, how many times do we hear God talk about that a worker is worthy of his wage? He takes wages very seriously, and if someone's denied them, he even says that they cry out from the ground, that these belong to those that have earned them. Verse 8, it says, he raises the poor from the dust, and he lifts the beggar from the ash heap, to set them among princes and make them inherit the throne of glory. He's able to lift up the person that's just in the dust, the person that's just where their situations in life have just put them. If you're poor, you're just in the streets, and even in a spiritual sense, if you were just in an area where, you're just in the state you are, you've never heard, you've never known, he's able to lift you out of that and bring you unto him. And he's able to lift the beggar from the ash heap. I was trying to think, what's the difference between the two? How would you consider a poor man in the dust versus a beggar in an ash heap? Well, an ash heap implies that there was a fire and that he lost everything. And in my mind, I'm thinking you have someone that was born into poverty and you have someone that has lost everything. Yet again, similar to the Job story that we were doing. One of them's in a position where he wouldn't really have a reason to mourn because it's all that he's ever been. Because he is poor, this other person, the beggar, has, if he's in ash, covered in ash, he has a reason to be mournful and a reason to be sorrowful. And I think about the idea that sometimes God will pull us from a broken place where we've come to the end of our own ability, or we're in a situation where all we can do is look up to him. And he can pull you out of that same position. But it's the same action. He has the same ability. There isn't any difference between the two. He finds us all where we are. To set them among princes and make them inherit the throne of glory. Yet again, to bring you from the poorest to the lowest place anyone could be to the elite, and to sit them in that place and into the company of the luxury and the provision that he would give, and to inherit the throne of glory. And I think about that because the inheritance that Jesus has attained, that he wants to share with the church, is his glory, is his throne and his position. And this is one of those prophetic things I see in here, this idea of, this is what I want to share, this is what I want to distribute, and this is what I want to call you into. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he has set the world upon them. Pillars are an interesting idea. And we had, I used, back when I was doing homeschooling things, we would have these different pictures. And I remember doing a word study one time. Well, it was a program about word roots, and it was talking about these are the pillars of your words, and this is what makes up everything. And it's the same idea here, is that every pillar, every area or substance that has form for creation and authority, God has placed on this. So, in other words, the pillars that would hold up the building belong to him, and he's placed the building on top. And something that's spectacular, something that's powerful, or almost supernatural in a way too, because you don't go find just a pillar out anywhere. It's been formed, it's been made, it's been built, and it has strength. But those all belong to him, similar to how we were reading the measures are his. And it says that he will guard the feet of his saints, but the wicked shall be silent in darkness. And he is the light to our path. I was thinking about the armor of God here, where, feet shod in the preparation of the gospel of peace. And peace is what guards our feet. Peace from the Lord, and in the gospel too. That is where we find our peace. That is where we find our security in the life and the testimony of Jesus. And where it says the wicked shall be silent. Yet again, we see that area where, let no arrogance come from your mouth. You have nothing to say in the presence of Almighty God. You have nothing to say against him. There's this little moment of time of enduring where they have the ability to pester, if you would, but they don't have anything that they can say that has any substance to it. Well, yet again, in our Acts study where we're reading about Paul, we're in a section where he's speaking to a large member of the Jewish population. And it's interesting because anytime he mentions something to do with the Gentiles in particular, this whole crowd just erupts. And they all start yelling and saying away with him. But then there's moments where he'll gesture with his hand and everybody will be quiet again. And he'll start preaching to them again. and they won't have anything, they can't argue with anything that he says about God, but once he starts talking about, salvation, it goes crazy again. And an interesting testimony that's happening there, because as Paul's doing this, he has this Roman guard behind him that's watching this, and all they're seeing is the comparison between the two. And I wonder how they were feeling when they heard that. Anytime he mentions us being able to obtain salvation, chaos erupts. But this is kind of a weird bunny trail I'm going down, but it's just this idea that when authority is given and he has that ability just to silence the crowd and to proclaim Christ to them, they're silent. And, just right here, silent in darkness. And that is a bad place to be. I can't imagine any worse position to be in. Darkness makes me uncomfortable. Nothing bothers me more than when I'm in a place and I have an inability to do something, or you're looking for the light switch, or you're looking for the door. You just know you need light from somewhere. It doesn't matter how small it is, but it's like your ability to even function's gone. But this darkness is interesting because it reminds me of the type of darkness that happened in Egypt, that plague of darkness, where it was talking about people gnawing on their own lip or tongue, just to know that there was something out there, that there was, that, they're not just in this void. It says, for by strength no man shall prevail, and the adversaries of the Lord shall be broken in pieces, and from the heavens he will thunder against them. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. For by strength no man shall prevail. Very similar to the verse we were reading where the bow was broken and their ability to fight was taken away from them. Man in his own strength doesn't really have anything going for him. And I'm seeing a lot of a cry for humility in this prayer as well. And, where is your standing with God? Are you humble before him? Are you, drawing from him? And in some ways broken, but in other ways as he is our provider, because we need provision, but do we understand that provision comes from him? And yet again, with my own personal challenge, that as I was reading through this, it was just that idea is, how often am I tapping into that source? How often am I looking for strength from him? And do I ever have days where that's in the back of my mind? I'll be bold enough to try to say that I don't find myself straying from God in a sense where I'm not relying on him, but I'm just wondering how often is that a focus or an attention that I have? How often is it a reminder? That shall be broken into pieces, the adversaries of the Lord. And that's pretty defeated. And we're not talking just about idols and just opposition in general, but we're also talking about, just I wonder what he would consider his adversary. And, separation, our sin, sin's been destroyed, it's crumbled away into pieces, it's not even there. And because God's a gracious God, he doesn't blame a particular person or event for what happened, because he wants that unity. And I remember the story of when the Philistines stole the Ark of God, and they took it in and they put it in their temple, and their idols were breaking, and they would stand them back up, and then they would crack again and fall on the floor. And, it gets to the point where they don't want nothing to do with it anymore, because their own temple's falling in on bowing down to this ark. And it's like, yeah, it's a crazy story after that too. But it's just this idea, though, because nothing can even stand. When we think about the prophetic dream that Daniel has shown us, where we have this statue with a head of gold, silver, bronze, iron, feet, and then, we got the clay mixed with iron. There's no strength to it, because if you were to try to mix those two and hit them, they're just going to shatter to pieces. At the end of man's reign on earth, that's the strength we have before God, is this idea that when he returns, we're already crumbling without him. And when he comes back, he'll be able to restore things to the way they're supposed to be as one solid under him. But even through our history, the highs that man would see are, going downhill as time goes by. From the heavens he will thunder against them, and a supernatural strength, if you would, but from his place, from his standing, and something that we don't have any control over. But I love how whatever it talks about God speaking, it says with thunder. I love to listen to a good thunderstorm. I love the way, like, you'll hear it echo. I really like how you can almost you can sense it approaching, because you'll get the flash and then you'll just be waiting, like, okay, when there it was. And I also like, it says how he breathes stars, just his breath, just his voice, just his speaking, how much power and how much authority and presence that it has. And when Israel was around Mount Sinai and God spoke from the mountain, we had this whole people thought they would die. They didn't want to hear it anymore. They told Moses, you go talk to God, because if we hear him again, we'll be dead. And the story is how they put up a line and says, nobody can go past this line towards that mountain. And but I think it's an interesting place, because shortly after that, Moses goes on the mountain and they fell right back to sin. They were just in a position where they were fearing for their lives. And then, one step backwards is all it took. This is an amazing little piece that we're about to read here, because it says, he will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Give strength to his king. It's capitals. We know that we're talking about God here. This is his king that he has chosen. There's a little bit of a near and a little bit of a far prophecy going on here, because sure enough, Saul's going to come to the picture, David's going to come to the picture, or Solomon, these kings that are going to be anointed over Israel. God's going to give strength to them. Saul's an interesting one, because you get to read the part where the Lord's strength comes upon him, and then you read the part where it's taken from him. And David, we the point when he's anointed and God's spirit of strength comes upon him. And these mighty men and the deeds of valor that we see them do. But the comparison is our next king is the King of Kings. He is the permanent, he is the anointed one of God. And that idea of King of Kings is interesting. When you think of every ruler or every great historical figure, every king in our history, all the power and the great deeds they have done, the thousands and people they've been over, the nations. So this couple of thousand of men that have existed in the history of our world have a king. There's someone that they bow down to, no matter how great, no matter how mighty they were. We're just given this kind of a simple picture, because it's even beyond that. But, for the sake of our minds being able to comprehend, he is the King of Kings, and even beyond that. When he's exalted the horn of his anointed, he will excel. Excuse me. But where we were talking about, what does that symbolize? It symbolizes his strength, his valor, his honor, his ability, and his royalty. And, it's saying God's going to, strengthen his king, and he's going to raise his power, authority, and strength, and honor, and valor. And she ends with that. And then they return home. It's an interesting little snippet right there where it just says, they went back to their house. And she leaves her son there. And it's just this out of the blue that she does this. And where we were talking about the idea of every little snippet we have of her in these two short chapters, she's praying. And she keeps praying, and then all of a sudden she's prophesying before the high priest. This wonderful little piece right here, and it just comes from her. And Like we were talking about, where she bears more children, her family's going to continue to grow. And I don't think her prayer life ends. I think she continues in that. I think that was her calling, and I think that was a gifting that God had given her and a heart that he had given her. And one of the interesting things about this is before the Holy Spirit was indwelling in in the church. This was from her as her offering to the Lord. This is what she was able to bring to him, and it's also how he was able to work through her. When we think about the idea of the gifts that God gives us, and I was thinking about that, if he's called you to prayer, does it naturally just flow from you? Is it something that is your yearning? And when you lead people in prayer, it's not in the sense that you're orchestrating their prayer, but you're just falling on your knees before the Lord and drawing them in with you. Study, are you someone that can study and can learn and take in information and share? And when people join you, are you just drawing them to that same place you are as a worship leader? When you're in your own place, are you just drawn naturally to that place of worship? Is that where you dwell with the Lord and fellowship with the Lord? And then when you're given that ability to serve, people follow you into that place. And that sincerity is still there, as you pray, as you teach, as you give, our help. And these are the places where your fellowship is, and it just draws in. And it's interesting when people share that type of gifting, because, when you have multiple people, we'll just say prayer again, multiple people that is their gift, that is their fellowship with the Lord, and they pray, you have an amazing thing happening, because that unity of the heart's there. As we get into one of the last mention of her, as far as I know, is going to be this little bit of a snippet that is going to talk about through Samuel's childhood. And it's going to go through a little bit where it talks about the evil sons of Eli, and it's given us these two men that are polar opposites of Samuel. And it talks about how they're taking the offerings that belong to the Lord. They're defiling the temple, basically. And then in verse 18 it says, "But Samuel ministered before the Lord even as a child, wearing a linen ephod. Moreover, his mother used to make him a little robe and bring it to him every year when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. And Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, 'The Lord give you descendants from this woman, for the loan that was given to the Lord, that they would go.' And then it says, 'Then they would go to their home. And the Lord visited Hannah so that she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the child Samuel grew before the Lord.'" And that's one of the last snippets we get of her life. And what an odd relationship that must have been for her to have after that. The idea that you might see your son once a year. And I wonder how, at what time she'd start making this little coat for him. And I don't know, I think it's kind of interesting. She comes and she'd start making this little jacket, and then they'd get together to have a sacrifice. But imagine approaching the temple and looking for him. Where is he? Where is he serving? What is he involved with right now? And he would be looking for them too, because he would know what time they were coming. But I wonder about the embrace. One of the odd things to think about is that they're approaching to offer sacrifice as well. So they're approaching, almost in like a defiled state. I'm here to make things right between me and the Lord again. And the idea that her son that she's looking for is already waiting for her. And that love and that fellowship's there. And as she comes, it's like, I wonder how involved he was with the process that they had. I wonder if he would find a place where he's watching as they would approach. And once they were finished, they would come and embrace each other. Or do you imagine he ever had times where he was the one that would help them, could inspect the sacrifice for him and send him along? I don't know. It's kind of a beautiful, but it's almost a sad thing at the same time, because there would be that time of great joy and then that departure again every year. But this idea that I kind of chuckled about the idea how many people would have noticed that, he started getting a new coat every year. And then I was like, oh, his mom came by and gave him a coat. But where it says he ministered before the Lord even as a child, we're seeing that that offering was accepted by the Lord, and it was. And he's using him even as he's growing, and instantly gets to work with him. And how much of a blessing that must have been for her to see that this isn't only something that was, offered or loaned to the Lord, but it's also something that he's using. And that contrast where we see that there were things going on that shouldn't have, and then there's this little light burning in this place. And the idea that God's not into child sacrifice. He speaks against it. He tells Israel, you never do that. You never slay your child for me. But this is interesting because she professed that she wants him to be consecrated to the Lord. I want him to live solely for you and not to be defiled by anything of this life or this world. And he goes right for it. When I was driving home from work today, I was thinking about it because the way kids are. And I wondered about all the other ministers in the temple at the time. If you get this little kid that comes or stands behind you watching what you're doing, what you doing? Why are you doing it that way? Why? And it's like, well, we're washing again. Well, why are you washing again? Because God told us to do it here, and when we do this, well, why now? And I don't think he was obnoxious, but the idea of that curiosity, taking in every little bit of information I can, he can. And I wonder about the idea of, well, hey, go help this person with this task, and he'd scamper over and do that. But how much of a blessing it was for them, because at the same time, would that have built energy for people? I wonder how many of them were, kind of excited to get to work with this little kid, or get to be able to share and teach him, and begin raising him up. And later on, when God speaks to him and passes the torch to him, if you would, you don't hear of anybody objecting to it. And I wonder how many people were praising God for the fact that that life had come through the way it had. And they had no objection to the fact. They knew even they could testify on his behalf of his character. And so this is just a small snippet into the first part of his life. And the three things that I was thinking about mostly when I was going through this is, am I willing to approach God and give things directly to him, to make my requests to him? And, to be able to ask and receive. And the second thing was, as it's his authority and it's his position to be able to make those things, to be able to be willing to give it to him, to do as he would, use me as he would. Here in a chapter or two, it's one of my favorite stories, and it's when God's calling Samuel. And he gets up and runs and goes to talk to Eli. Eli says, I didn't call you, go back to bed. A little while later, he gets called again. He runs in again. And Eli, it's one of his only recorded things he teaches someone, and it's one of the greatest bits of advice he ever gives anybody as well. But he says, when God speaks, tell him your servant listens. And take action then. And that is some of the greatest advice you could ever give anybody today. When God's on the move, when God speaks or calls on your life or gives you instruction, be willing and ready to say, speak, Lord, or move, your servant's ready. And, work with me how you'd work with me. Do with me what you will, or, teach what you will. Lord, I just thank you again for your word. And I just thank you for the fact that, you are who you are, and how you have everything in your hands. And, Lord, I just praise you for the fact that just the idea that the weights are yours, Lord, and judgment and authority all belongs to you, and the fact that the things like that are holy and set aside with you, and that they can't be defiled, and how much encouragement, how much security we have in that fact that you are the one that holds together all things, and you're also the one that orchestrates all things. I think of the lives of all the people, and just how the world can seem so big and seem so, imposing on our lives. And the fact that you've given us victory and you've made it so, the mouth can't speak against us and they don't have any power against us. And this idea of the nagging or the, hindering of our lives that they would try to do, that it doesn't have any substance to it, Lord, that their bows are broken. And I also praise you for being our righteous judge as well, Lord. And the fact that you're the one that's above and over in all creation. And, and I just pray again that, your word and your ministry just flows through every one of us and through this entire place, and that nothing hinders it, Lord. And neither us nor our enemy or anything of this world, that is able just to flow clear through and affect everyone that it can, and just have a washing and a renewing as it proceeds, Lord. I just pray for this church, for encouragement and for strength in you, and that your spirit is welcome in every place of our lives and strong. And I just lay all these things down before your feet, and I pray this all in your name. Amen.